our panel discussion today.
Okay, so I'm pleased to be starting the panel discussion. I'm Naomi Takewashi, the relationship manager from FinCity.Tokyo. Well, we've heard a lot from policy people, and I think the audience will be curious to know what business is like in Japan. So this panel, we have a stellar lineup of speakers representing the various niches of the asset management and fintech business in Japan. So we are, and they have all very broad and in-depth Japan business experience. So let me just first introduce the four panelists that we have. From AIMA Japan, representing the executive committee, we have Nick Silva. From FIA Japan, Director Russell Beattie, who I believe is based in Hong Kong and is joining us from there. IBA Japan, we have Gary Stanton, who's the Secretary General. And from the FinTech Association of Japan, Takeshi Kito-san, who's the Vice Chairman, will be joining us. Yeah. So I'll be asking the panelists to do an intro of themselves, and then we'll have 3 questions which each panelist will be speaking about. So first of all, I'd like each panelist to introduce themselves, what they do, who they are, what organization they represent, and your business in Japan. So if I may, could I start with Nick, Mr. Nick Silva from AIMA Japan. Nick, may I ask you to do your intro, please?
Thanks, Takegoshi-san, and thanks to Tokyo for putting on this great event. My name is Nick Silva. I run equities here at Credit Suisse for Japan. I've been in Japan since 2018. It's my second stint here. I was here from 2003 to 2007 before moving to Hong Kong for 11 years. We chose to come back about 2 years ago, and over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, I can talk to you about my experiences since I've been back.
Yeah. Okay, so Nick, thank you. Have you completed your intro? Yeah, okay. So thank you very much, Nick, for your intro. And then I would next like to hand over to Mr. Russell Beattie from FIA Japan.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for the opportunity to participate today. I'm representing FIA Japan, where I'm an elected board member on the advisory board. I currently am residing in Hong Kong. I was in Japan just after March 2011 earthquake when I moved up, and so I've been in Japan from 2011 to late 2014, and then relocated back to Hong Kong in 2015. So I've been able to maintain my relationship with FIA Japan and obviously with FIA Asia. Here in Hong Kong, I represent Bank of America Securities, where I run the futures and options business and OTC clearing business in Asia Pac. So I run a regional role here in Hong Kong, but have very, very fond memories of my time in Japan. So it's an honor to be on this panel today. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell. So next, I'd like to ask Mr. Gary Stanton from IBA Japan, please, to introduce a bit about you and IBA Japan.
Thank you very much, Takeuchi-san. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So thank you very much indeed for this opportunity. Delighted to be here. We are, IBA Japan is very supportive of both FinCity.Tokyo and more broadly Japan Financial Services. I first came to Japan in 1982 and I've been coming backwards and forwards in various different roles in financial services since then. I took over the IBA Japan Secretariat at the beginning of 2019. We do a number of things. We have about 50 members, global banks and securities firms, or I should say the Japan operation of those firms. We provide information exchange platforms for them to use. Used to be face-to-face. These days it's mostly online, like this seminar today. Out of that, we do a lot of lobbying and advocacy on regulatory issues and sometimes other issues. We work very closely with the Japanese authorities and great to be participating today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Gary. So next I'd like to introduce Kito-san, Mr. Takeshi Kito from the FinTech Association of Japan. Please. Kito-san, I don't think we hear you. Sorry, are you on mute? We still can't hear you. Yeah, I think we're picking up some noise, please.
You me?
Yeah, yes, we can. Great.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. Please
Yeah.
go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. I'm Takeshi Kito, Vice Chairman of FinTech Association of Japan, and I'm leading Capital Markets and RegTech subcommittee. And also, I'm sitting on an advisory board for the government of Japan's regulatory Sandbox. And our association, FinTech Association of Japan, was established 5 years ago. And now we have 150 FinTech startups and 260 financial institutions as our members. And our FAJ's mission is developing FinTech ecosystem here with other stakeholders, and also developing, deploying financial innovations to the market here. And in terms of international activities, we have concluded MOU with other 25 international FinTech hubs and associations such as Singapore, Hong Kong, and UK, and Denmark, so many countries, and working together to promote cross-border collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kito-san. Yeah, thank you all for your introduction. So now I'm going to go into the questions, and I might just change the order of the panelists slightly as we go along. So the first question I'd like to ask each of you is, in your respective business fields, what opportunities do you see? So could I please start with Nick?
Sorry, could you just ask? On behalf of AIMA, the Alternatives Industry Association. It's a huge opportunity here in Japan, and I think that a lot of regional and global asset managers have long understood that Japan represents a huge opportunity with respect to generating alpha. This is a market where there are somewhere around about 4,000 listed stocks. Debatable as to whether there'll be 4,000 listed stocks in the years to come, but certainly for the moment there is a huge amount of opportunity with respect to some of the continuing reforms that were brought in during the Abe era over the last 5 years. Corporate governance efforts, stewardship efforts, consolidation of corporates and subsidiaries, and so forth. So there's a huge sort of, I guess, active engagement movement here in Japan. In addition to that, some extremely interesting high-tech listed companies here in Japan. The IPO and sort of equity capital markets pipeline is still very, very healthy here in Japan. There are 3 live active multi-billion-dollar deals at the moment between the primary and secondary markets at the moment. And we've got a market that's relatively buoyant and is turning over $20 to $30 billion a day. So it's from an equities manager perspective, fantastic opportunity. You know, hard to see a better opportunity to run a hedge fund where, you know, you can borrow and short stocks relatively easily. And you know, availability of capital is there as well. So, you know, this is still really the #1 game in Asia.
Thank you, Nick. Yes, we do actually see the buoyant stock market value at the moment too. So yeah, that's good to hear. And so you spoke from the fund manager. From the investment perspective, how about as alternative managers, the allocation by institutional investors funds to an asset class which is alternative asset, which is should not the majority in Japan? Could you maybe touch on how you see the market in terms of hedge funds receiving allocation from Japanese investors?
Yeah, so look, Japanese investors have long been, you know, seen as a very reliable source of capital. You know, they do their due diligence in great detail, but once they're in, they tend to stick with managers and they tend to, you know, form long-lasting relationships with the managers that they allocate to. On the manager side of the picture, you know, you have an industry that really started to kick into gear again probably 2 years ago with the launch of several new fairly high-profile launches. You've had a good amount of activity from some of the larger platforms as well that are generating, you know, significant P&L here in Japan from their activities. And so, you know, generally I would say that there's quite a nice ecosystem here. Some things that have obviously been impacted negatively by COVID include the ability for global allocators to do due diligence on Japan and Asia-based managers, and you know that's a problem that I think everyone is facing around the region at the moment. But certainly, you know, given that there is such large pools of capital here in Japan from Japanese institutions, you know, pensions, insurers, etc., this is you know, I guess by being on the ground and forming relationships with these institutions, you know, there exists a lifeline for managers that choose Tokyo.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for elaborating that point. Thank you. So can I now ask Kito-san for the same question, what opportunities or potential you see in fintech for firms who want to come into Japan?
All right, so there's multiple subsectors in fintech industry in Japan. But I think one of the biggest subsector here is payment, because the government here sets a target of cashless payment ratio, which is 40% by 2025. So many financial institutions and fintech startups trying to implement their own payment solutions to the market. And another subsector is, I think, crypto, because our regulator, FSA, enforced a regulatory framework for crypto exchanges and security token recently. So many crypto-related companies also developing their own exchanges and services and to accelerate crypto-related industry here. And the last one is, I think, wealth tech, because in terms of investment amount to the fintech startups, wealth tech, wealth management plus technology is yes, is one of the huge subsector in Japan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Kito-san. First time I actually heard about waste tech being mentioned in fintech. Yeah. Okay, so can I next turn to Russell, please, for your insight on what opportunities, potential you see in your industry in Japan?
Yeah, look, when I thought through this particular question, I took the opportunity to just take a step back, okay, and looked at it in three ways. historically, where have we been as a business or as an industry? Where are we now, and where do we want to get to? Okay, so those three buckets. So if I look back 15 years ago, many banks and security houses, regional banks and security houses, had Tokyo as their center in which they basically hubbed Asia. All right, for many, many years. I mean, Bank of America, you know, or Merrill Lynch, you know, has a long, long history with Japan. Okay, and so the trigger over that 10-year period or 15-year period, we saw a migration to Hong Kong and Singapore. Okay, so that's currently where we are right now. Now, the challenge for us is how we turn back that clock. All right, and that's you know, this is what we're looking at right now. So a lot of the changes that were made, i.e. when banks moved their hub or their central organizations to Hong Kong or Singapore, it was through the consolidation process. And through that, we saw a lot of electrification of the markets, and obviously headcount overall contracted substantially. And so by definition, you were able to do far more different markets with a smaller amount of people or headcount in one central location. And so what we found is which we have today, we have a lot of centralized roles operating out of Hong Kong and Singapore. So when we think about as an industry, and this is what we've been having discussions with FIA Japan, is how do we get those key regional roles back to Tokyo? All right. So it's not going to be focused just on the Japan market. Yes, the Japan market is extremely important. Yes, it's a big part of the total wallet opportunity that we have. But to attract key senior financial executives and get them to relocate their families from either Hong Kong or Singapore back to Tokyo, they've got to have the opportunity to potentially do regional roles. All right, so the incentive program, I was very impressed by some of the earlier comments that we had in the session about how much detailed reform that the government initiative is currently looking at. So the key is get those regional hubs, so those regional businesses back into Tokyo, and then you've got to look at yourself that how can you do that regional role from Tokyo? Now, for many years, we traveled extensively. Having Haneda Airport was a fantastic opportunity. You could hub out of Tokyo easily. I know I did for 4 or 5 years myself. It's very doable. But in this new environment with the COVID right now, the sheer fact that we have, you know, this is a classic example. We've got 300 people, I think there's in 30 different countries participating in this session, all right? And none of us are actually traveling or moving. So it's amazing what we can actually physically do. So the incentive now is get those businesses back into Tokyo and do their regional roles from Tokyo and leverage some of the efficiencies that basically the initiatives that are being driven now by the government initiatives as they go forward. So that's what we're doing at FIA Japan right now, is trying to bring key individuals with market experience, you know, in our industry back to Tokyo to conduct those regional roles.
Thank you, Russell, for this comment. So very good that you've pointed out Tokyo as a regional hub, meaning Tokyo having a kind of a strategic oversight of the
Right.
APAC business. And I suppose it is now a very interesting time in terms of when you look at the geopolitics and where Japan stands in relation to the situation in the rest of Asia, or in a situation where free trade is being a bit endangered, and Japan being kind of on the vanguard to promote free trade, for example. So yeah, it's maybe it is a very good time now to actually look at Japan as a regional hub. So thank you very much for bringing that perspective into this discussion. So can I next ask Gary about your or IBA's perspective on opportunities, potential in the Japanese market?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I 100% agree with what the previous speakers have have said. I mean, in terms of specific opportunities, not just in our industries, but I mean, we do banking and securities, but just across the piece more generally. I mean, obviously everyone's saying Tokyo is one of the most liquid and easily accessible markets in the world. There's an increasing focus on corporate governance, and that will be continue over the next few years. So certainly Tokyo should become a much more attractive place to invest in. I think that will be accelerated as JPX consolidates its markets from 5 to 3. One of the policy recommendations from the Financial Systems Council was to kind of have another look at the not just at the corporate governance code, but how they can improve corporate governance more generally and make Tokyo more attractive. Absolutely agree that, you know, Tokyo as a complementary financial hub, complementing, you know, this concept of collaborate to compete, I think is a very interesting one. And, you know, the authorities, I mean, we'll talk about it a bit in the next question, but everybody's kind of pushing in the right direction for that. I think there are a number of changes being mooted in the regulatory environment to help all financial services firms. And I think that in itself will create opportunities. Also in fintech, I mean, obviously we don't have lots of fintech companies per se that are part of the IBA, but, you know, all of our members are looking at fintech opportunities, both from you know, new profit opportunities and also in terms of creating efficiencies in their businesses and reducing costs. So, you know, it's not all easy sailing, but there are many things that are in the offing now that I think will improve things substantially over the next few years and make Tokyo an even more interesting place to do business and make money, which I think ultimately is what people would like to see.
Indeed.
Thank you, Gary. Actually, there was, I think, a question which came in, which was from one of the audience saying she has an impression that Japanese companies just bank with Japanese banks. And is that true? Is that a myth or a fact? And where does the foreign banks kind of make the most business in this market?
So do I have to answer that question then?
Yes, I thought I'd jump into that. Yes.
Okay, so I can't speak. I mean, I can't speak for all of our members.
Yeah, sure.
I think there probably is a perception, you know, particularly if people are not familiar with the domestic market, is that, you know, Japanese firms prefer to use Japanese banks. I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. I think there are, you know, I'm sure many of our members' client base here is, you know, have as many domestic firms as foreign firms. You know, calling us kind of foreign banks is a slight myth because if you look at the if you look at the kind of the staff population of foreign banks, actually, I don't know what the numbers are in percentage are in total, but it's probably 70–80%, you know, Japanese staff, and a far smaller percentage of non-Japanese than it used to be. Certainly when I was here in the 80s, and even the non-Japanese here, people are pretty fluent in you know, they're pretty bilingual. So I think it's a slight myth that Japanese firms only deal with Japanese banks. Clearly it's about relationships. Clearly it's about, you know, what services you provide. So I think, you know, for all foreign firms, if you know, every market is different, every culture and every language is different. If you can kind of adapt your approach to the Japanese market, just like you would to any other jurisdiction, I think you have opportunities with Japanese firms. But, you know, it's Japan. Don't expect it to happen overnight.
Thank you, Gary, for elaborating on this very question, which I kind of threw in out of the blue. And yes, as you say, although it's called International Bankers Association Japan, yeah, you are very much plugged into the local banking ecosystem, and yeah, the Japanese corporates growing globalization, international business activity. I suppose that makes it also very relevant to your members who are often multinational and bring in expertise globally. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much. So we were talking now about the current, as it were. My next question is about any interesting change or trends that you see in your individual business sector, or not just in your sector, but in a much broader socio-economic context. So let me start with Russell.
Look, this is a great question, all right? And I think it's very, very topical of some of the environments that we're seeing here at the moment. Now, look, if we look back over the last year with COVID, it's been a very, very tough year for a lot of people. Particularly if I was to use an example here in Hong Kong, you know, the challenge is that there's been no travel. I used to travel probably every once or second week. I was regularly traveling as part of my regional role. I have not flown since January when I came back from my Christmas holidays. So, you know, we've had to really, really change things around. Now, how's it affecting people here in Hong Kong? And I think this is something that we can take an advantage of. Clearly, the geopolitical environment here in Hong Kong is causing some general underlying concerns with people. You know, we are seeing people leaving Hong Kong and sending their families back to Australia or back to the UK or Germany or to Europe, wherever they are. And, you know, frankly, what's happening is the primary breadwinner, if you like, or in the family, whoever that may be, is really staying in Hong Kong to work while the family is being relocated to another location for either safety reasons around COVID, or, you know, we've had 18 months where we've had, you know, a series of, you know, student demonstrations, which was very disruptive for the city, and then we've moved through. So it's been a very tough year. For all the years I've been in Hong Kong, this has probably been the toughest 18 months. Now, if I was to say on a personal note, I have 4 children. 3 are back in Australia at university, effectively doing online studies. And my youngest daughter now, just recently, we've pulled her out of school and she's relocated back as well. So I'm here in Hong Kong. So what's the advantage? What's the sweet spot? Yes, Tokyo has a situation where, you know, you have to be careful, social distancing and COVID, but there's definitely an opportunity for lifestyle, all right, for key staff, all right? Families have an opportunity. You have a country, you have countryside, you have, you know, lifestyle choices that in Tokyo, for example, are amazing. They're world class, you know, the mountains and everything else you have. So you have an opportunity for families to actually be together as opposed to separated. And that's currently what's happening here in Hong Kong. So I think the biggest thing at the moment that in favor of Tokyo right now across a range of industries is its political stability, all right, and its ability to have a balanced lifestyle in which, you know, if you can attract key executives with their families, I think people have always had amazing experiences in Tokyo. So the upside is taking advantage of some of the unrest that we're seeing in Hong Kong and at the moment, and trying to attract those key people back to Tokyo.
Thank you, Russell. Okay, can I ask the same question to Nick, please?
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of what Russ has just said. You know, I was in Hong Kong for a lot of years, having spent some time here first, and coming back, I guess I've been, you know, pleasantly reminded of just what a wonderful place it is, that it's so easy to get out of Tokyo on a Friday evening and, you know, head up to the mountains, even with, you know, the COVID situation, and I guess being, you know, very sensitive to the prefectures that haven't really wanted to attract inbound tourism, you know, certainly during the early stages of the crisis. But, you know, the fact that you can go down to the beach in summer or up to the mountains, both in summer and winter, has been great. You know, we've got 3 kids. They're in one of the international schools here, and we pulled them out of one of the, you know, very good international schools in Hong Kong. We were somewhat concerned that what we were going to experience when we came here, and we've been pleasantly surprised that they haven't skipped a beat. You know, I guess a lot of the international schools source their teachers from the same sort of roster of teachers. You know, the standard of facilities have been really good. You know, the extracurricular stuff. I spoke to a couple of the schools today, just ahead of this panel, just to sort of gauge where they're at with respect to spots. And, you know, having spoken to them, there are places. You know, they want to hear from families who do want to move to Japan, move to Tokyo. And so they're certainly willing to engage in conversations with families to ensure that they can accommodate people. But it's not like there's been an exodus from other locations to Tokyo. So there are still spots available. But yeah, I think from that perspective, from a lifestyle perspective, it's a phenomenal place. And I think a hell of a lot of people in other parts of the region and other parts of the globe acknowledge that, and then they just try to look for us as leaders in Japan to try to smooth out some of the less appealing parts of doing business in Japan. And it's really encouraging to hear from the FSA earlier and from Tokyo government itself that they are, that they acknowledge the problems and are working on them. And some of them are probably intractable, but a lot of them can get moved with with a lot of will and goodwill on both sides. So just sort of going back to what Gary said as well, the TSE has embarked on pretty ambitious reforms. We're expecting by April 2022 to have a vastly slimmed down first section of the TSE, and potentially a thinned down topics index as well. If that happens, that does lead to a huge amount of opportunity with respect to listed companies having to either increase free float to stay inside the TSE1, or consolidate to get large enough so that they meet the market cap criteria. There's a huge amount of opportunity. I think this is an extraordinary period that we're coming into. So, I think the best way to take advantage of that is to come up and be on the ground. And really get to meet with some of these corporates and some of the financial institutions like ourselves that are doing work on it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. So it seems that we're in a really great juncture at the moment in terms of business, but also changes. The regulators being willing to listen and make strides to introduce some of the changes which in the past were just impossible. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to Kito-san.
Yeah.
What do you see as interesting change or trends in Japan for fintech firms?
Yeah. One topic I would like to address is the regulatory sandbox in Japan. And 2 years ago, our government launched its regulatory sandbox. And the biggest difference from other sandboxes is that the Japanese sandbox is a cross-industrial sandbox. So it's not for financial sector, but all companies can use that sandbox. So this sandbox is under the Prime Minister and under the Cabinet Office. So that means that it has very strong power. And also this sandbox is open to all companies around the world. So if you want to test your solutions in the real market, and also want to change existing regulatory frameworks here in Japan, you can use this sandbox. I believe this change is quite huge, and also this changes brings us huge opportunities for fintech startups and financial institutions.
Thank you very much, Kito-san, for mentioning the sandbox, which I think one of the attendees actually asked about. So thanks very much for addressing that. So Gary, may I please ask you the same question about opportunities, trends, change that you see?
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, I guess if I can paraphrase kind of what I think is happening now, to use the phrase, the stars are all aligned. The central government, I mean, Tokyo has been a great proponent of developing financial services for many years, and now the government is clearly promoting enhancements in the financial services industry. It was mentioned specifically in the new economic strategy, and actually some quite specific, regulatory, I won't say call them changes yet because there are discussions to be had, but that government strategy mentioned firewalls, it mentioned digitalization, it mentioned kind of, Japan as a kind of financial hub for Asia. Obviously, that filters down to the ministries and to the FSA. And actually, things have been improving for a number of years now. I mean, under Commissioner Mori, he's now 2 commissioners ago, really started this trend, continued under Commissioner Endo at the FSA, and now we have a very international and well-known internationally team heading the FSA with Commissioner Himino and Morita-san, who's head of international. They will continue this, and so everyone's kind of pushing in the same direction. And financial services is sort of having been back off the central government's radar for some years because there were other priorities. It's now back on, and financial services as a key industry to kind of support development and growth of Japanese economy, I think, is very important. And for me, a very big change that so we have things won't happen overnight, but there are discussions kicking off now which have been difficult to kind of put on the agenda for a number of years. So I am kind of quietly optimistic, and that obviously will create, as these things develop, will create opportunities for both new entrants and people firms that are here already.
Thank you very much, Gary. So that brings me to the final question to each panelist again. So what would be your one message that you'd like to convey to the people listening to this webinar for entering the Japanese market? So, okay, Gary, why don't I start with you?
Okay, good. I've got my sentence prepared. Good. So I having been involved in Japanese business for quite a few years now, I think we all know that historically things have not happened as quickly as some of us kind of non-Japanese would have liked, and that's down to just the way things work here. So things don't happen overnight, but I think under the Abenomics, although he's now resigning, under Abenomics, what I call the Japanese Supertanker, which is very difficult to kind of change direction, it has actually changed direction. And I think for me, that's a very positive thing about Japanese economy, and that will permeate many, many sectors. COVID-19 has just kind of sought to kind of provide us some focus and highlighted, maybe accelerated some of the changes. But broadly speaking, the Supertanker has changed direction, and I think that's really positive for Japan and positive for all of the kind of foreign firms either here or coming here in the future.
Thank you, Gary. Okay, so can I ask Russell then, please?
Yeah, I've got a slightly different view on this in the sense that coming to Japan doesn't necessarily mean that you only do Japanese business. All right, and that's what my message to everyone is: come to Japan as a regional hub. From my seat, we divide our wallet opportunity up into 3 buckets. So it's business that comes into Japan, business that can go out of Japan, all right, as you go through, and then obviously business that's domestic on domestic. So by coming to Japan, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are just doing domestic on domestic business, and that's what your focus is. So coming to Japan, it's perfectly positioned to run a regional role in the time zone. It's safe, it's scalable, it's got infrastructure here to be able to leverage off. And as the previous panelists have mentioned, the government is heavily engaged at this particular stage to bring in the efficiencies or the changes necessary to help facilitate that migration of talent back to Tokyo. So it's, as was previously said, the planets are aligned. So it's a good time.
Right, like that phrase, planets are aligned. Okay, so Nick, can I ask you the same question? What one message to the audience about doing business?
I'm actually taking a look at some of the questions that are coming through now, and so my final message will hopefully try to address a couple of these. But you know, we're just having we're just saying goodbye to our interns, our summer interns that we've had coming in from Japanese universities. Today's their last day, and you know, Russ and I worked together 15 years ago, and we've seen our fair share of interns over the years. And I'd have to say the quality of interns that we have had, language skills, general interest in the markets, and just engagement and you know, just super high quality. This is a country that's got 125 million people. We've been attracting a huge number of foreign students as well, particularly, you know, mainland Chinese students to some of the higher quality Japanese universities over the last few years. So you've got, you know, Mandarin skills, you've got obviously English skills and Japanese skills. It's a really, really high quality talent pool to choose from. And so, you know, I think that there is I would call now misperception that talent is a problem here onshore. And so I would you know, encourage people to take another look at what their perceptions on Tokyo are. Yes, there was a hollowing out of the gaijin, you know, post Lehman and so forth, but that, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that the quality dipped. But certainly it's a very vibrant financial center.
Agree.
Thank you, Nick, and also for addressing this young talent issue, yes, which I would have been really keen to expand on the panel, but time was restricted, so I'm really glad that you addressed that. Thank you so much. So Kito-san, last but not least, your one final message to the audience about entering Japan.
My message is that the fintech industry is kind of ecosystem, and collaborating with many stakeholders in the market is quite important. So we are really keen to help you to join fintech community here in Japan. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any interest or questions, further questions for us. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kito-san. Well, I suppose that brings the end to this panel. Thank you very much for the panelists for bringing in such rich insights into this discussion. And I'm just conscious that we could not address all the questions. We would have liked to continue longer, as a lot of what you shared really was very insightful and I think draws lessons for people who are interested in Japan. So thank you very much for the panelists. Normally, if it was a real event, we'll do a round of applause, which online, I don't know how we're going to work it out, but thank you very much. Okay, so.